last but not least on this exam paper, we have questions 7 and 8. Question 7 is normally the most challenging question on a Unit 4 exam paper, and it tends to be the question that gives you the most information and the most data to analyse and expects you to answer a number of questions to do with the collection of data, the setup of an experiment, what we call how science works questions. Question 8 tends to be a bit more straightforward and have some long answer questions. So let's look at question 7. Question 7 is about malaria, and it's about malaria-suffering lizards on a small Caribbean island. Question 7s are often quite unusual. They'll often present you with information on a subject that you've never really looked at before and expect you to analyse it in a scientific way. It tells you that the scientists investigating these anolis lizards with malaria sampled both populations by collecting lizards from a large number of sites. It asks you to explain for the first question the importance of collecting lizards from a large number of sites. Now that should be a nice straightforward question for you. This is just like being asked why we do repeats of experiments, and you should know by now that we repeat experiments and we take a large number of samples in order to get a reliable mean, to identify anomalies, and generally to get reliable results. So this is my answer. I've said that collecting lizards from a large number of sites allows a reliable mean to be calculated and anomalous results to be identified. Either one of those 2 points would have got you the mark, but to make sure I would always write both. Following on from that, it asks us to describe a method the scientists could have used to ensure that sites were chosen without bias. Now when you see that term without bias in the question, you should be thinking about random sampling. We do random sampling in order to prevent bias. But this is a 2-mark question, and it's a describe question. So we're not looking for just a very simple answer. We're not looking for something as simple as saying random sampling. We're actually looking for a description of how random sampling might be carried out. Now the usual way that we carry out random sampling within a geographical area is the way I've described in this answer. We assign numbers to coordinates within an area, in this case the island. So the scientists might get a map out and assign random numbers to lines on the map in a grid pattern. They then generate random numbers using a random number generator to identify the coordinates that they want to sample. Now, for a question like this, they're asking for a description of how physically you would do this, so details like the use of a random number generator and the fact that coordinates would be used are important, and you do need to mention those things for the marks. We then have a suggest question, and it asks us to suggest reasons why the population number of both species of lizard varied over the course of the year. Now this is a bit of a common sense question. You've got to come up with some reason why the population of a lizard might increase or decrease over the course of a year. Here are 2 suggestions that I've put in. It could be to do with food availability. Perhaps in the winter there's less food available. It could be to do with predators. It could be to do with the breeding season of the lizards. It could be to do with the climate at a particular time of year. There are lots of different things you could write, and the 2 answers I've put there are by no means the only things you could have said. Question 7s are normally quite difficult in Unit 4 papers, but I hope you'd agree that the first few questions here aren't too difficult. There are normally some nice easy marks on these kind of questions. What you've got to make sure of if you want to get good marks on question 7 is first of all that you read the question thoroughly, and second of all that you know how the examiners expect you to word answers to do with collecting large numbers of samples, why we do random sampling. You do need to get the right kind of wording into answers like 7A1 and 7A2 here. Following that, we've got some data to look at. It tells us that the scientists investigated the percentage of lizards of both species that were infected with malaria at different sites on the island. So, where we've got percentages in the table down here, those percentages are referring to the percentage of lizards in the population that have malaria. They also collected samples of both lizards at intervals of 3 months in a year, it says, and it says that they recorded the elevation of each site where they collected the lizards. So in this table below here, we've got on the side increasing elevation, going from 10 metres, presumably above sea level, up to 414 metres. We've got the total number of lizards collected of each species, and we've got the percentage of each species infected with malaria. Before we try and answer any questions, we should try and get our head around what's going on with this data. Looking at this data, I can see a few different trends. As we increase in terms of elevation, I can see that there seems to be a general increase in the number of lizards that were actually collected. So, for the gingivinus, one of the species of lizard, there seems to be a pretty steady increase up to 370 metres as elevation increases in the actual number of lizards that we find. For the A. wattsi, there seems to be an increase up to the same amount, 370 metres elevation, and then after that for both lizard populations there's a slight decrease. So it seems that these lizards quite like being high up. They prefer being at high elevations because as you go up in elevation you tend to find more lizards. So that's one thing I can see from this data. The other thing I can see is that there does seem to be an increase in the percentage of lizards infected with malaria as we increase in elevation. For the A. wattsi, the lizards in the last column, none of them seem to be infected until you get to around 315 metres elevation, and then the percentage steadily creeps up to about 4%. For the A. gingivinus, again none of them are infected at the lowest elevations, but as you go a bit further up, there seems to be an increase in the percentage infected up until about 300 metres. After that there seems to be a slight decrease. The numbers go from 46 down to 31 and then fluctuate a little bit. You do need to be careful when you're looking at trends in tables that you don't just look at the first part of them. I'm sure a lot of people doing this question will have missed the fact that these last values here are actually lower than the value for 300 metres, and it does decrease a little bit after that peak. In general though, it is fair to say that as elevation increases there does seem to be an increase in the percentage of infected lizards infected with malaria. If we look at the actual questions then, it tells us that when analysing the results the scientists have used the percentage of lizards infected. Now this is another standard kind of how science works questions, and there are very similar questions that the examiners have asked in the past to do with ratios. We use ratios and percentages for the same reason in science, and it's to help us to compare different groups. In this case we've got lizards at various different sites and we want to be able to compare them fairly. That wouldn't be possible if we just looked at the number of infected lizards. It's only fair if we use the percentage of infected lizards, because a large group will have more infected lizards in general than a smaller group. If we use percentages though, we can compare those populations and those populations of lizards at different sites fairly. So the answer I've put there is that by using a percentage it allows for a comparison of the different sites, even though the number of lizards at each site may vary. Following this we've got an evaluate question. Now an evaluate question always expects you to give arguments for and against a conclusion or a suggestion. In this case the suggestion is that malarial infections were more common at higher elevations, which is one of the things we drew from our analysis of that table. But we've got to evaluate it, so we've got to give evidence in support and against that suggestion. So what I would do is I'd put something like this along the left hand margin of the page. I'd put something reminding me to put some points for that suggestion and something else to remind me to put some points against it, and then I'm going to make sure that I've written a balanced argument. Here's the answer that I've come up with. We said that in general the percentage of infected lizards of both species does seem to increase. As we go higher up the percentage increases. However, for A. gingivinus, there was a slight decrease after 300 metres, so that could be a point against it. Looking at the table, it does seem like relatively few A. wattsi lizards were actually collected. If we look back at the table, the results for 120 metres actually only come from 3 lizards over the course of an entire year. Now that's not a very reliable, it's far too small. So, as a result, the fact that we've got relatively few A. wattsi lizards could make our results unreliable, so that's a point against our conclusion. Now we've got 3 points there. Any 2 of those would have got you the marks. Moving on, we come to the end of this question, which is normally where the harder questions are put by the examiners. Now it says here that as a result of this investigation, scientists concluded the presence of malaria provided a competitive advantage to A. wattsi. So we're trying to find reasons why the malaria might have provided an advantage to A. wattsi. We need to use the information provided. So again, we're going to want to look back at our table. Now when we come to look at our table, we've already mentioned the fact that it seems that a higher percentage of A. gingivinus seem to be infected with malaria as you go up in elevation. And in fact, at all elevations, there's a higher percentage of A. gingivinus infected with the malaria. So it could be that the fact that A. gingivinus tends to get infected with malaria more is giving some kind of advantage to the A. wattsi. There is some evidence for that statement in the table. The other thing I can see is that where I've got a very high percentage of A. gingivinus infected with malaria, I seem to have more A. wattsi. So it could be that the fact that there are quite a high proportion of A. gingivinus lizards infected with malaria in the bottom part of this graph, which I've highlighted in blue, that could be the reason why I seem to have a higher number of A. wattsi lizards at higher elevations. Could be due to another reason, but it's a plausible suggestion. So here's my answer. I've said that a higher percentage of A. gingivinus were infected with malaria than A. wattsi, and more A. wattsi were present at sites where many A. gingivinus were infected with malaria. The basic idea here is that by killing or harming the A. gingivinus lizards, it seems to be providing an advantage to the A. wattsi lizards that seem to be being infected less. However, you can only get the marks if you have used data from the table, and those are the two bits of data that examiners wanted you to comment on. We then have another suggest question. As I've said, suggest questions are all about using your common sense and what you've been told to explain what's going on. Now it tells you here that the malarial parasite of these lizards destroys both red and white blood cells. So let's go to my highlighter. We've got red and white blood cells. Now it's a 2-mark question, and you've been given information about two different things, red and white blood cells. So it's a fair bet that the examiners are expecting you to write about the destruction of both red and white blood cells. Now it then says, suggest how an increase in the percentage of A. gingivinus infected with malaria could result in A. wattsi having a competitive advantage. So it's basically asking you, what is it about the infection with the malarial parasite that leads to A. wattsi being better, having an advantage over A. gingivinus? Now you're not experts on malaria, but it has told you that they destroy red and white blood cells, and you should know what those things do. So you're going to use what you know about red and white blood cells to explain why A. wattsi has the advantage. Here's our answer then. Red blood cells are involved in the transport of oxygen in the blood. You should all know that, I would hope. So when the red blood cells are destroyed by malarial parasites, that leads to the A. gingivinus being worse at oxygen transport than A. wattsi. Now white blood cells are involved in the immune system, so if there's a malaria parasite in all the A. gingivinus lizards, those lizards will have a worse and less effective immune system than A. wattsi, which will again give the advantage to A. wattsi. The final question in question 7 is not one that we've studied the answer to so far. When we look at our ISA this year, we will look at the terms probability and chance and how those relate to statistical tests, but you haven't been taught that yet, so you can ignore that question. I'm not going to go through the answers to questions 8a, b and c, and that's because the answers to questions 8, b and c should be fairly clear from the mark scheme. These are all fairly straightforward, factual questions. In this first question, you're asked to explain the advantages of using an integrated pest system. The second question is an explanation really of eutrophication. Hopefully you picked up that that's what this question was about. And in the third question, you're asked to explain how the intensive rearing of domestic livestock increases net productivity. I don't think these questions are in any way particularly challenging. If you knew the information and put it all on the page, you should have got some marks. The only piece of advice I would give about these questions is make sure that you put sufficient information in. I would suggest counting the number of keywords that you've put in order to make sure that you've put sufficient information to get all the marks. Make sure that you do know the mark schemes for these questions, so that if any future questions come up that are similar, you'll get all the marks by remembering what the mark schemes were. For question 8b, you were expected to explain how nitrate led to the death of fish in fresh water. So for that particular question, you had to focus on how eutrophication would have led to the death of fish, which would have been due to the reduction of oxygen in the water caused by the respiration of saprophytic bacteria. If you do want any help with any of these longer answer questions, speak to me or speak to your class teacher. I hope that these series of videos have explained to you the answers for all the questions. If you do have any further questions, then please ask.